people have had this view that like there's a progression, like getting to a point where you're expressing something and say like a surreal, I can't say that word, surreal way, like, surrealism, getting heavy into that is progression as opposed to just another form of expression. Because by the definition of progressing, you're leaving old things behind. But even people who really like surrealistic things or transgressive things always still have a love for things that I guess are more normal. I just think that points to that there's not you're not like pushing the. I don't believe the envelope can be pushed. I guess I would go back to that. There's nothing new under the sun. So I would just, I wouldn't write what doesn't go along with that ideal. Like I'm not going to write against the ideal. And some people say that that's limiting, but I don't really think that's limiting because there's not a reason to do anything. Like you're not just writing into the void and throwing stuff at the wall. Like there's an ongoing purpose, but you just have to realize that there's never going to be actual movement along a line or a path because following that type of logic, we're going to get into an era where there is like no actual story. It's just postmodernism and craziness thrown about, which that stuff can be cool. I'm not dogging it. I just don't think it's new.
Well, I've thought a lot about some of the stuff you post, and I think the thing that I struggle with the most is like, and this might be a very visceral way of describing this, but maybe here's where I struggle a little bit with some ways of looking at things. So like when my neighbor approaches me, like one thing I hear, even if it's not exactly what he's saying, bless you, whoever that was. Yeah. Has that been? Oh,
yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. So I feel like he's saying you're a bad person. So like, it's one thing to talk about like, well, what makes you a good person? I'm not saying that distinction is always important, but if you care, shouldn't that response be just as important? Like if you do care about like what you're doing, and maybe the reason why I feel maybe a disconnect between like an ideal, because I know what you're saying about that endless black hole. Like I remember that for a while I got really steeped in Burroughs, and yeah, I appreciate Burroughs, but I realized it kind of felt empty at the end, and I had to acknowledge what that meant. But I also felt like one of the things that's hard to distinguish and why it's easy to go off the deep end is because, at least for me, I feel like art, you get Burroughs everywhere. Like you don't just get it in a book by Burroughs. And the reason why that's a problem is because you can easily slip into these mindsets that might be antagonistic to your ideal. And so my thing is like, I totally want to acknowledge that I have an ideal of some sort, and I'm trying to convey that. It may not always be pure, but if it is something as simple as like, well, you're a bad person, or like, this is bad, it seems simplistic in that I can't really make it better. There's nothing that I can do that's better. And except I guess just for like changing the way that you write. But the reason why I bring that up is because I think the reason why I have a hard time with an ideal is because it feels like it's not really there. It feels like the ideal is kind of just something that I invent and that I'm just imagining for myself. And obviously it's different for you in your context, Zach, because you have a specific ideal you're talking about. But for me, it does feel like I become more Burroughs than I maybe mean to.
Okay, so you're asking specifically like, okay, so obviously when I say ideal, I'm talking about spiritual truths and whatnot. When you're asking what this guy, like what you could say to him to, I guess, prove yourself in like the merit of the art in a certain way. Yeah, I would say that, even though I'm talking about having an ideal, I'm realizing that I'm never going to get to it. So, I mean, I'm pretty much free to read anything I want to or write. Well, I'm not going to say write anything I want to, because I'm obviously not going to write glorifying something that I think is evil. But with art, you just have to realize that it does encompass the whole of humanity. I would just assert that the whole of humanity at this point is really low. And I think a lot of people put a lot, like, they'll say that there's something more artistic or heightened about an extreme horror film. Whereas I would say, there's no real indication of that. But every artist can pretty much produce everything. So writing out someone because they're human and putting this, you know, being an artist and constantly creating and constantly changing, that's basically that dude is putting himself at a level that he's being very judgmental in the sense that he's never going to, be that pure. So you should just explain to him that you're not all these things exist in everyone. You got that out at one time. That doesn't necessarily encompass like your whole existence or whatnot.
Yeah.
I find
No, I appreciate that. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I find it. I mean, there are exceptions, but I find it interesting that by and large, the Christian writers I know are less moralistic about fiction than a lot of the secular leftist academic would-be writers.
I would say that is because at a fundamental level, we agree that humans are flawed. The things about the secular leftists is they believe that they have to create this utopia on Earth. Like you can go back to Nietzsche, and I know that Nietzsche in his context doesn't fit this. I simply say people misuse Nietzsche, i.e. the Nazis being the best example, to the sense that they say they don't believe the myth has spiritual and metaphysical backing, so they're creating something that's flawed and secular and then trying to enforce it. And that's why they're so, they're not encompassing all of humanity because they're trying to make humanity have to be something that it's not. So, I mean, like when I'm writing about something evil, I truly believe that it's evil, whereas they see it as something that just fights against their ideal, like racism. They'll say it's evil, but it doesn't, I don't think racism gets under their skin the same way, I don't know, some like extremely crazy form of Gnosticism would get under my skin. Because they believe it's just a human who is, a soulless thing, an ape that can just ultimately be killed for being racist because, we have to make the world a better place. Whereas if I'm writing about a supernatural evil, I believe it is like that evil, like, I don't want to say personified, but real, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, Christians believe in a mythology that I don't believe in, but at least their mythology encompasses and accepts evil as part of the world. Whereas the sort of secular religion that's developing thinks that evil can actually be eradicated.
Yeah.
If you just punch enough Nazis.
Yeah, and they do. I mean, I hate saying that because at this point it is the most cliche thing to say that the hardcore Antifa types become fascists. But I think when you get away from the political perspective, because that was the one thing that really got on my nerves, is when whatever that dictionary was started saying that fascism has to directly apply to right-wing ideals, and maybe in a completely political sense it does.
No, I don't think it does. I mean, there's evidence in history that fascism was totally left-wing. I bring that up because
fascism does refer to an actual ideology that is right-wing. You're just thinking of totalitarianism, which it can be all over the political spectrum.
Fascism as a definition is specifically right-wing. I just wanted to double check that.
Well, as an ideology, that because if you can point to incarnations of it, like the most modern one would probably be something like Saudi Arabia, as a religious kind of fascism, and historically, like the ones who coined the term was, of course, Mussolini, with his fascist party.
I think that's why I brought that up, though, is I think my confusion with the definitions is like so, and this is kind of convoluted, but like the whole point of like left-wing structures is to not be authoritarian. But I think when you realize that, for lack of a better word, that left-wing ideologies can still be fascism, I guess that's the wrong word, but I'm just saying, like, I had thought that left-wing ideas weren't supposed to include the state, but they include the state just as much as right-wing, if that makes sense.
I really think it's just a difference between, like what Ben said, all these things kind of fall under that totalitarian banner in the sense that they believe humans can be perfected by the right economics, and this is where I'm going to get slightly anti-American, common sense morality, or common sense in general, because they boil all these morals down to being completely rationalistic as opposed to having a legitimate metaphysical backing. And that's how they become so crazy, because, like, at the end of the day, you can't get any of these people who believe in such things, from fascism to the other side, the Antifa type ideology, to say that they believe there's legitimate backing for their claims without being stupid, or just being outing themselves morons, because their whole definition is this has to be enforced by a state. Therefore, the state is becoming what we're upholding, as opposed to a natural law of things, a natural, I'm not going to say equality, but just sense of morality, because they're not, they're just, they have to admit that it has to be enforced by force, which, of course, you read the communist writings, they're all about that. So they don't have anything moving their bodies forward when you start talking about, like, the will that moves them forward. Like, the religious folks like me, we believe that it's this actual truth that's moving us forward. They believe it has to be created and enforced. Therefore, they're not fighting for actual truth. They're fighting for their own version of very strict morality that has to be, again, enforced. And it starts to break down when you be like, okay, well, maybe a little bit of this is okay, or maybe a little bit of that's okay. And they'll say, no, I believe it has to be all or nothing. Then you'd be like, why? They cannot, they can't explain that away. It's completely relative. And their only response is to freaking put people in gulags and camps and whatnot.
And that's not really a novel criticism, because that's been a sort of a infight within the left for most of it, that that a number of leftists fall back on using the state as a as a bludgeon. And at the first international, Bakunin had said that people aren't happier being beaten by a stick just because it's called the people's stick.
So I know it's a different tradition from Christianity, which I guess is directly opposed if you're talking about someone like Sartre. But the thing that I think about is actually the notion that the reason why people would offload their responsibilities and potential to the state is exactly because freedom is scary. It's kind of a caricature, but I think it's important for at least identifying why these issues are so fraught with difficulty, because the horrifying truth is that we are free, and the worst thing that we can do is offload that to institutions and things that don't, like the state, that don't care about us as individuals. And so I'm not sure if that's necessarily opposed to a Christian view, but
wait,
I just feel like,
I'm kind of confused.
Well, no, it is confusing. I'm just saying, like, if we're talking about like how we decide how we should behave and what we should believe, I think what generally happens is you are manipulated into believing certain things by, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, power structures, and that's what I worry about. And I'm just saying, like, the reason why I highlighted Sartre is because he was thinking about, like, and I don't know how this fits with his actual politics and what he would say about state control. I'm just saying that his point was that we tend to offload our freedom because we want something that's safe. And I think that's one. And I was just going to also tie that into the problem with the left, is that the reason why the infighting is so huge is because more and more, like, the more fringe radical leftists want to offload all of their freedom to some kind of state or authority. And other people from the left are like, no, it does get better. There does seem to be evidence that it gets better. And this is important because we don't have to get rid of everything and force it and enforce it. And they just point out that that's important. So, but then that's why there's the pushback though, because it's not extreme enough.
I mean, that's a interesting example because the reason Sartre had a falling out with Camus is because it came out that the Soviets had, prison camps and labor camps and shit like that. And Camus denounced the USSR for that.
Interesting.
And but Sartre supported them.
So then was Sartre on the wrong side of history in that view? Because I didn't know that.
I really hate that term, wrong side of history.
That's
but
fair. No, that's fair.
I think he was wrong.
That's funny. I was just about to bring up the fact that they keep saying wrong side of history all the time, because when we were talking about Marxist determinism versus Christian determinism, I was thinking, well, Marxists do believe that there is an inevitability, and it's called the progression of history.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, dialectical materialism is supposed to be it's supposed to be the idea of taking things in their historical context, and supposedly it's supposed to be a means of predicting the future. The more hardcore tankies think it's a science. Myself, I think the analysis can be useful, but treating it as inevitable and as an all-encompassing narrative. I mean, that's kind of why postmodernism came about. I think that makes a lot more sense, viewing those kind of truths as being contingent or, as having certain contexts rather than being universal. And I think that includes the Marxist analysis.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't understand. Oh, go ahead, Anne.
I was just going to say, as annoying as postmodernists can be, they do tend to at least try to put a temper on people's more radical certainty about their own bullshit. But I just, as we were talking, I noticed that wrong side of history phrase has always bothered me, and I just kind of figured out why. It's because they're reflecting that sort of Marxist determinism.
Even then, I mean, they would deny it, but for the most part, they do attach a sort of moralistic dimension to it, where his history is not. I mean, history is not a process of a process that's has a good or a bad or wrong or right. It's just the progression of time in human history. It's not
the only reason why I worried. Yeah,
it's not something you can say is this has a good end or a bad end, or it's like a book with a ending or a narrative, because it's not.
Yeah.
The only reason why I worry about Sartre, though, it was probably the wrong phrase because it is a loaded term. I just meant that if there is a consequence of your communist beliefs leading, and we don't have to go into this because we have before, frankly. So I mean, it's complicated, but I was just thinking that if your communist belief leads to gulags, maybe there should still be some degree of responsibility though for that view. And I just wondered if, looking at it from the contrast of Camus and Sartre, if Camus may have had a more neutral but maybe more grounded way of looking at it, because for him it was this is leading to people dying, and you're not realizing this because you're fanatical, Sartre. That's kind of how I read that.
Yeah, I mean, Camus was an anarchist, so he was, in a sense, more radical than Sartre was. And you have to go into one of the biggest problems with the left is the USSR is it's like this this horrible chain that's around the ankles of every modern leftist, because if you look at it honestly, it's pretty clear where it went to, how it resulted in a lot of just totalitarian states, how it was a totalitarian state, how it resulted in Stalin, who just was this complete psychopath, how it resulted in a lot of shortages and things like that. And it seems like we're divided between we need to either the USSR was never a good idea, we should never look to state power to progress a more equitable society, or it's we still need state power, but the USSR wasn't good, or just the tankies who just say no, the USSR was good. Uncle Stalin is my daddy.
So that's interesting to know. Yeah, I'm fascinated that was the reason for their falling out, because I read the original essay, but at the time that I read it, which was years ago, I had actually sided with Sartre, and the reason was because I was like, Sartre's actually standing for something. But I never, later on when I reflected on that, I didn't like that view, but I understood why I had that view. And I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to say is, we do tend to justify our own views all the time. And the problem with that is we miss out on the places where they're wrong. In the case of Sartre, as an example, Sartre wasn't willing to acknowledge his views were radical, that there were real consequences to his beliefs and his politics. So...
But that's maybe it's not that he was fanatical. It's just sort of that he, but maybe that is the right term. It's a case of, well, the ideal is good enough that if we have to, work with a state that keeps, that, throws people in labor camps, it's okay because it's the means to an end.
Yeah.
Wow. That's how we started at giving Pink Phoenix basically a pep talk, and now we're in the Sartre territory. I read Nausea a long time ago, when I was fresh out of high school, and it kept my interest, but I don't really feel like he said anything earth-shattering in it.
I think The Stranger is a lot better.
Wait, by Camus?
Yeah.
I read Camus in high school, and I don't know. Aside from the death of the Arab, I didn't find anything noteworthy in it.
I thought it was pretty great. For me, it's just it's like the Virgin Chad meme with Sartre as the Virgin and Camus was the Chad.
Go ahead, Dan.
My favorite Camus is La Peste, which I think is probably translated as the plague.
Oh yeah, the plague. It's either the plague or the famine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the plague.
Yeah.
What is it like about the plague particularly?
Well, I read it quite a long time.
Yeah, I know that a lot of people have recommended it during the COVID-19 quarantine.
Yeah, well, a lot of things are prescient of this year, mostly dystopias, but it was also a really good example of an author using one central metaphor to really great effect throughout an entire novel. He had this image of a fléau, which is like a whip or a flail, just turning over the city this whole time, and it keeps echoing back. And I mean, aside from the fact that he's just overall more entertaining than Sartre, but yeah, which makes sense because, I mean, who's ever met a really entertaining fanatic, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we were talking before about what our limits are, and I was thinking, you know what? My limits are shitty writing. Somebody could even write one of those upper middle class stories about their grandfather's funeral, and if they did it well enough, shit, I'll read it. Sorry, go ahead, Jeremy.
Well, I was just going to say, and you mentioned Updike earlier and how he's like considered the standard bearer of mainstream literature and everything. But I mean, so you saying you didn't find anything valuable in the Rabbit Run tetralogy? I thought those books were great, especially Rabbit Redux.
I hated Rabbit Redux.
Huh?
I hated Rabbit Redux.
Really?
I thought Rabbit Run was good, but Rabbit Redux was just. It was basically. It felt like this old guy trying to understand what the changes of the 60s were, and
that's what it was.
And he's not understanding it, and so it's just this like subtle racism and sexism running through it, and it's just like I come up with this stupid contrived idea to have this like black militant and this hippie girl move in. when his wife moves out and then the house burns down, and it's just like there's no story here. The story sucks.
But that is the story. He's having a midlife crisis. There's plenty of.
Well, that's what sucks about it. It's like
the discussions that him and Spider have are
they're completely one-sided.
No, they're amazing for that time. No, Spider has his side, and Rabbit has his.
I don't recall Rabbit having any sort of response to what Spider says. He just sits there and lets this black militant.
Well, he's the status quo. He's the status quo, and Spider is rebellion pushed to its absolute, peak, and they clash. And I mean,
and it's not good. It's not interesting.
It is good. Well, I mean, you don't have to like it, but yeah. I mean, I think it's that's my favorite book in the whole series, and I think a lot of ground was explored in it. So
I mean, Rabbit Run is decent. Rabbit Redux was just like, again, it's just like Updike just being an old man not understanding the fucking changes happening, and he wasn't even that old at the time. He was just a fucking square.
No, he's not. Yeah. He took those people in. He took those wild people in.
It was contrived. It was
square. Dumb. He smoked pot with them in his house and let Spider beat that girl that he pimped out or whatever.
Oh that's of course. I mean, he only does that because he's an asshole. It's not because
he's an asshole for letting these.
Yeah, Rabbit is very clearly an asshole
for letting him stay with them. For letting those people stay with him, he's a scum. What?
No, he's just an asshole in general. That's why he lets that's why he lets him get away with beating like a woman. And that's why he just leaves his wife to sleep with a young hippie for no reason.
Yeah, the problem with the Rabbit...
That's what midlife crisis does to men. I'm not saying that they should let that happen to them. I think I'm rather frustrated when I see people going through midlife crisis because it seems like it could be controlled and contained, socially. But for some reason, sometimes men in their middle, 40s and 50s, they completely change on a dime and things that they do things that can't be rationalized in a way. I don't know, but I mean, that's basically
that's also part of the problem. That happened in the first book. He had a midlife crisis in the first book,
and his dumb wife went and drowned the baby. I never understood how he accepted that.
Yeah.
Well, that's another problem. Is that they just kind of gloss over that.
My problem with the Rabbit books is that you can tell that Updike kind of thinks his character is an asshole, but he can't make up his mind whether he wants to do satire or not. Like, I'm reading Tom Wolfe right now, and Tom Wolfe does kind of the same thing, but he does it brilliantly because he lets the satire rip completely. Because, for one thing, and this is why writers grow up, his characters are no longer just a fictional avatar for him. He has, even if they resemble him, he has some distance. But Updike cannot decide whether he wants to do satire or not. And so the attempts that he makes to make Rabbit seem like a not such an asshole after all don't work because the satire isn't sharp enough. And so, like, his attempts at making him understandable and likable kind of weakly fold into the weak attempts at satire. And don't get me wrong, I found them very easy reading. But when I was done, I felt like I really hadn't learned anything or felt anything or really even laughed out loud. And right now I'm reading... Go ahead.
I was just going to say, that's kind of what I mean by the homogenization of literature, though, which is like, do we have to write like Updike? Well, no, but we feel like we have to. But the reason why that's important is because I actually think we should write stuff that isn't very good. I don't think we necessarily feel encouraged to do that, though, because we do expect to be like Updike. And the other thing I was going to say, just as a side note, is I actually really appreciate this conversation in terms of thinking about the context of Updike, because I think if there's something he did very well from just my limited reading of his books, his short stories, he was very good at conveying an image and a scene and a world, or maybe not world, scene might be the best way of describing it, a plot. And I think that can be difficult to do as well, to like be that, like that may be another reason why he's been successful, is because he has that way of writing that you know what you're referencing.
Right.
So yeah, that's pretty cool.
That's a really good point, though.
I love this entire series. I've just got to say, I was really, I'll always, it'll always be close to my heart. I just like, I like the character.
I was
Been given
originally
2
planning
stars.
I was originally planning on reading the whole thing, but I really disliked Rabbit Redux, so I stopped.
I don't understand it because that's my favorite one to this day. And I know other people who say the same thing. But, I know it's not, you probably don't relate to it at all. I get that. Different people.
I mean, the thing is, like, Yeats's Young Hearts Crying had a lot of the same kind of thing in it, but that is a way, way better book, like miles ahead of it.
Was that a poem, or what was that book?
It's Richard Yates. It's called Young Hearts
gotcha.
Crying.
Okay, yeah, I don't think I'd heard of him.
He wrote Revolutionary Road.
Gotcha.
Which
okay.
I think is that's a really great book. I really love that one.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It probably sounds like I absolutely hate Updike. It's not that I hate Updike. It's another one of those William S. Burroughs discussions where, he's fine for what he is. If you find his characters interesting, I understand that. He does what he does well. But the people who try to write like him,
it's like, who tries to write like Updike anymore? Like, Updike is kind of held up as like the the square, the establishment of the time, which is probably not accurate. Someone like that would be someone who's been completely forgotten, like Taylor Caldwell or Cousins or someone like that.
I've actually heard that this one right here, the Centaur, is a pretty weird one, that a departure for his work, and that I just wanted to get that in.
Right. Well, I'm just touching back on what Phoenix said about how what I said about his work not being able to decide whether it's a sharp satire or whether it's trying to make the character genuinely likable and failing at both. It's, no one tries to write like Updike anymore, but he was part of the setup of, and maybe there's not a straight line, but, all the people. And back when I tried to do those creative writing classes in 1992, 93 or so, people were still being trained to write like him. And so people who are running creative writing courses now, he's not cool, but they still have that training. And there is a line, however, zigzaggy between his kind of blandness and the sort of dictatorship of the middle of the road that we've got going on now in fiction. Well, the middle of the road and very bland radical leftism.
What is that? How are you talking about the divide?
The divide. Like, this is just my reaction to his work.
Okay.
He's not quite writing satire. He's writing about an unlikable character, but he can't quite decide to make him unlikable because it's kind of him.
Yeah.
You just got that that's the thing. Like, wasps aren't like Jews. They don't have enough self-awareness to be like completely, self-effacing. So they have to like put something in there to make them look redeeming.
Yeah.
Which is why Philip Roth was a better writer than Updike.
Well, because
I love Philip Roth.
So Roth is an interesting example.
Yeah, I really like Portnoy's Complaint. That's a great book. That's hilarious.
It's hilarious, and it is autobiographical, but he's not trying to like polish himself up.
No, he makes himself look. He probably makes himself look worse. Like when he, like that scene where he fucks a liver, puts it back in the fridge, and then it gets served to his family for dinner.
Well, no, wait. So I thought that was Sabbath's Theater where that happened. Okay, I guess not.
No, that's Portnoy's Complaint.
Okay, what is Sabbath's Theater about? That's the same guy, right?
I don't know. I haven't read that one yet. I've only read Portnoy's Complaint, and I have a copy of Our Gang on the shelf.
I can't remember the book that I read by Philip Roth, but one of the things that I thought was actually really hard to read, but that was probably really clever on his part, was just how awful the characters looked. Like, you didn't like anybody, much less the narrator, which is like really... So that's why I find this interesting, this contrast between Roth and Updike, because Updike might be described as a serious writer, but Roth might be, for the ironic reasons, more interesting because he captures those elements. As you said, Roth is totally satire.
Ben, tell me.
I'm not knocking on Updike, by the way, Jeremy, because I should probably. Yeah.
I just want to hear this one more time because I've heard mention of this before in passing. I just want to understand this. So what he like masturbates onto a piece of liquor?
He it's like when he's a teenager, he fashions a liver into a fake vagina and fucks it and puts it back in the fridge and it gets served to his family for dinner.
Ew.
His mother says
it's bad. It's bad.
It's kind of hard to keep track of all the stuff he masturbates onto in that book.
Yeah. So it's kind of weird when I read that book because in that book, like he's when he's a teenager, he's very hung up about having sex, but I don't recall him making like a big deal about actually losing his virginity.
Yeah.
That's a little. I thought that was a little odd, but for the most part, it's a pretty funny satire about both sex and how sex is perceived and of Jewish identity. Because one of the I don't know if this is really a spoiler, but there's a story in it where he meets this where he's in Israel and he picks up this girl who's an Israeli soldier, and when he tries to have sex with her, he can't get it up. He finds that anytime he's in Israel, he can't get it up at all. He can only get it up with Gentile chicks.
Huh. Wait, what about the Gentiles and whatnot? I wasn't paying attention because I was in debate.
Philip Roth.
Pay attention.
Philip Roth. Part of the satire of like Jewish identity in it is that the character Portnoy, he's only able to have sex with non-Jewish women, and like when he tries to have sex with a Israeli woman in Israel, he's like completely flaccid.
I mean, I guess that just came up because you can't compare Roth and Updike without comparing wasps and Jews.
Yeah, exactly.
Like Updike is so quintessentially wasp, he doesn't even realize it. Which that's part of the problem with Updike is he's just not really self-aware or self-conscious.
So Roth is well liked in this turf, huh?
I don't
speak well of Roth. It's at least Portnoy's complaint.
Okay.
I read something by Roth and I actually didn't like it. It's that thing where I probably valued it because of its creativity, but actually, and Roth might be a better writer in terms of like the self-awareness, which I think is pretty crucial and important. But I think Updike, with a little bit I've read, I think Updike actually is a pretty good stylist. Just like the words that he uses and the way he writes, I think it's a little bit more memorable than Roth. Roth felt almost too like immersed in like what was happening, which I know sounds ironic because you want to be immersed. But in that world, I was like, this is awful. Like, why would I want to like experience this? And at least Updike is just like conveying a scene. So,
well, Sturzinger did talk about like when they were using like Updike as an example in her creative writing classes. Well, they used him as a example in mine too. His story A&P, which I hated that story. I've always hated that story. Yeah, it's like it's basically just an example of how to like stretch out like the thinnest idea over like several pages with a bunch of like fancy words.
Yeah.
I know what you mean, but I actually liked that story, and I liked it because I thought it was boring. I found what's his name, Hawthorne, more interesting as short story Young Goodman Brown, because I remember reading some of those stories. But I think the irony was that the story by Updike was impressive because it was so like it felt so real, and I was like, some of these other writers, even though they're interesting, I can't quite connect as well because of the language. Not just because language changes, which isn't their fault, or even like the actual skill in the language they were using. I just mean in that I didn't feel like I was a part of it in the same way as maybe like Updike's story. And I think that is more, I think that's more of an example of like changing tastes. So I'm not saying it's like legitimately like objectively a better story. I just found that was very interesting that it was like that. So
I mean, that's part of why I didn't like it. I didn't feel like I was in like some teenage boy's head, which is what it's supposed to be. It felt like I was in some middle-aged writer writing what he thinks like teenage boys, how he thinks teenage boys think. And teenage boys are staring at tits all the time, but they aren't doing it in this flowery, poetic way.
But isn't that the hard thing about writing though, is like staying true to a perspective? Like, how do you convey the perspective of the opposite sex? Like, that's really hard to do. And even when I think people do it well, people are still like, no, that sucks.
I mean,
Or
yeah,
conveying a character. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, you have to use your imagination, basically.
Well, yeah, but
Or,
I mean,
you know, talk to people.
yeah, I mean, it's definitely valid to have like a lot of the perspective, like actually looking at the perspective from other people's perspective. I just think that when you're actually writing it, it becomes more complicated. And I think part of that is actually because of language. I think it's really hard to convey, and the fact that you're not that person. But the other thing is, yeah, I don't think the language allows for that kind of nuance, depending on how you use it, I guess.
What are you reading lately, Phoenix?
So I'm trying to finish Dahlgren. I'm like 40 pages done, almost done. But I realized that I don't know if I like that book as much as I thought I would. I'm also reading a book that I was excited for. It's described as a kind of introduction to quantum physics, and I've read a decent amount on quantum physics. But after listening to Eric Weinstein talk, I wanted more of the terminology. So I was like, maybe it'd be good to go over the history of this and like see how people talk about quantum physics, to like actually have the language and kind of brush up on some of the other things that are interesting about it. So I'm reading that because I really like that. And then I'm also reading a book on language, which is fascinating in and of itself, by John McWhorter, who is a linguist, I think. And it's interesting how he takes Steven Pinker and Noam Chomsky to task on this book, because he's talking about how language evolves. And one of the conclusions that you can reach that he's made in his book is that language actually doesn't really have a grammar. So with Chomsky, you get the idea that language is biologically rooted. Therefore, there's a kind of universal grammar we can all rely on to be able to make sense of language in the world. But he actually says, using a lot of different examples of dialects and things, that the structure of language is actually arbitrary. And the reason why that's very interesting is because we are told that there is a standard way of talking, but that doesn't mean that that's the only way of talking. And granted, if you are using words differently, there is a sense in which the standard kind of milieu will not take you seriously. But the idea is that language really isn't that structured, which does go against like the Chomskyans and like some of these views where they think that it's more of a structured thing. And it's interesting the examples that he used too. So I'm also reading poetry. I've been reading some sonnets. I've been reading sonnets from the 20th century, although I have a collection from going up to at least Shakespeare. But I like that because even though the structure of the poems are not necessarily as I would say structured as maybe like Shakespearean poems, it's interesting to see how the form has evolved, and like the way that language and form is just constantly changing the forms that we use to convey things. So anyway, I didn't mean to go off on a tangent. I found those books to be interesting. So
yeah, it's kind of interesting to like look at language that way, because one of the things with languages is that it's a completely closed system. It's always self-referential. It's like we can never, language can only ever refer to other language. It can never, go outside of it.
Yeah. So what do you mean by the closed system? Because I've heard that before, but it gets used differently depending on the context.
Like when you like that, just like I said, language can only ever refer to other language. It can never really go outside of language.
Because I feel like that's a little bit hard for me to understand, because you do want to assume that language corresponds to something in the world. You don't have to, but we often do when we're trying to explain it. So if the ironic conclusion to draw is that language actually doesn't convey anything, or convey anything at least that's in the world, it's just ironic. It's like, what is the purpose of language then? Is it a tool? Is it just like this thing that we use that's very nebulous but kind of inaccurate? Is it something that even just like hides our reality to begin with because it's the wrong form? I wouldn't go that skeptical, because I find language to be valuable and beautiful. I'm just curious when we take it that far.
Yeah, it's not that I think that language is completely useless, but it is something that, if you're looking at it like, realistically, that it's basically, you kind of come to a point where you kind of realize that the signifier can never really directly refer to what's being signified. and you just kind of have to work from there.
Yeah, how does that work in terms of capturing experiences? Because, like, do you feel like words convey what you feel like within, or do you feel like it's more of just the manifestation, but not necessarily like, because an example with this is like with painting, we often expect it to be accurate, right? Like, as you may as well be taking a photo, and we even think that as a cliche for like Da Vinci, where they're like actually capturing reality through their techniques. But actually, they take risks, or not even risks. They do things that are not accurate, even intentionally. So the idea is that the mediums that we use don't have to convey anything about reality. We just often assume they do because of a kind of realism bias, so to speak.
Yeah, that's true. Like a lot of like abstract painting gets dismissed. Just kind of it's kind of this idea that painting has to refer to something, that it can't be like just an appreciation of colors and shapes and so forth.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, there was an example with that of like the brush strokes were very messy, but you couldn't tell because it looked real. It wasn't until you looked closer that you realized it was messy. And that's kind of the idea. Like, you should be able to use the medium to challenge yourself, to challenge the expectations, to challenge the form. Not that everything has to be like super like, edgy or whatever, but it's just interesting that we often think that it has to be accurate to life. But maybe the way that you express yourself is ironically by conveying things that you don't feel. And I'm not saying that that's easy to do. I mean, I think I see a lot of my writing as an expression of myself. And I think the reason why I found these points interesting is because I'm actually trying to move away from that. It's just hard to do sometimes because we have our own biases and stuff. So this would be an interesting example too. Like, that's not reality at all. Like, but it makes sense to us because we see it represented.
Yeah, and that's sort of
good.
Yeah, it's sort of like and like I mentioned before with the surrealists, a lot of them weren't like they weren't attempting to like give things like this like meaning per se. It was just an idea of taking what's in the subconscious mind and putting it on on canvas or in sculpture or in verse to to bring us to show us what is within the unconscious mind.
Yeah, that's cool.
So who else has got any reads, in the last 2 weeks they want to talk about?
I've got a lot.
Yeah, I bet. We already covered Leonard and Hungry Paul. You might want to add something on that. What else?
Give me a second. Let me pull up my Goodreads. I've read a lot.
Cool.
One was Dodgeball High by one Bradley Sands.
Now, preface here. We are talking about a publicly available work. We are not impeding on this author's personal life. We are talking about a product that was meant for consumption, a book that was to be read, and that is what we are discussing. We are not speculating on their personal life, even though they're a bit of a weenie. Go ahead.
Exactly. That's a good way to put it.
Just had to get that in there, didn't you?
I would say I enjoyed it. It was like it reminded me a lot, maybe just because of the school setting of the old show I used to like called Ned's Declassified School Survival Guide, which was like a kid sitcom that is way after your all's time. The one thing, I was entertained throughout it and read it in one day. The only thing about it that I can say I honestly disliked was that I didn't feel a sense of purpose, in the sense that it wasn't like, I'm not saying it had to be highbrow, but it felt like it just devolved into a bunch of kind of stupid humor and pop culture references. Now, they were fun, but I kind of went away from it thinking it I wish the characters would have been a bit more, I guess, well-rounded and relatable as opposed to just jokes.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what they were. A lot of them were kind of jokes. Like, it was all super high concept weirdness. But for what it was very fun. I also read the first uh, Travis McGee book by John D. McDonald called The Deep Blue Goodbye. And I've been wanting to read those books forever because I know they're considered like golden, pulp era fiction and almost classics in that sense. And my best friend growing up, his stepdad, who was a big reader and a guy I always thought was really cool, he's like obsessed with those books. And every year he will go back and like reread all of them. Like that's how much he loves them. I think there are 21 books in the whole, and there are like all kinds of other things, like an official Travis McGee quiz book, and it's just
What is it? This is a detective or what?
well, it's a detective, but it's a bit different. It's like I guess like a beach bum type detective thing. So it's not a mystery. I mean, it is a mystery type thing, but it's not like it's not in that kind of category. It's like you could read it as just a its own book that has those tropes in it, but it's really character driven.
He spelled "bye" wrong.
He spelled what wrong?
On the cover, the goodbye, that's not how you spell goodbye. Is that purposeful?
That's you can spell it in different ways, and that was an acceptable way at the time.
Okay.
Yeah, I think. What was I going to say? Oh yeah,
I've heard that it's really cool to read the novels one after the other in order because like there aren't things that you have to follow, but since it's pretty character driven, you kind of watch the main character progress through it all. And I can really get that sense. Like the thing that really makes it good is there's a lot of fantastic writing and kind of philosophical asides, which, I mean, nothing profound, but it's fun. I really had a good time with it. Then I also read, I've been reading on this off and on for a while because every time I'll read even freaking 3 or 4 pages of it, it just blows my mind and gives me a lot to think about. The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom, which isn't what you think it would be. It shows like a kind of mini history of philosophy and where we're at in that history. Like we're basically where Nietzsche said the last man in a very bad connotation is. And he never really gets conspiratorial, but I've also been, delving into a lot of history of Gnosticism and different philosophical bents that I would say are, pretty evil in, the anti-religion sense. But it seems like there's an era when, like, right when TV started, everything became lowest common denominator and pushed towards a radical revolution sense. But that's only the last part of the book. The best part of the book is like 300 pages of just great philosophy and it's just amazing. I can't really. There's almost you could talk about like 5 pages of it and have 5 pages each episode of the show. And there'd be a lot to talk about. It's how dense it is.
What does he believe exactly?
I believe he's actually Jewish. I might be wrong on that, but he believes that we've gotten to a point where I guess I'll have to be freaking brainy and crap and go back to Socrates, where Socrates was disproven when he says, like, okay, obviously Nietzsche had a lot of problems with Socrates in the sense that Socrates said that the philosophical man, and philosophical in this sense being a person who thinks about the world in terms of morals and science and things like math, like all of it being together. One thing, like Socrates had that right, and we have it wrong in the sense that we compartmentalize everything. And so everyone's a specialist who knows nothing about the whole. But the other thing is that Socrates' like radical rationality has really been disproven quite beautifully by Nietzsche, and you could even say Kant. But people consistently misread Nietzsche and use him to promote his type of relativism, which to him was profound, but it kind of like degenerates over time to where people were saying Nietzschean things, but they're doing it in a completely dumb manner. And it goes back to that, I guess, Gnostic and Satanic sense where like the liberation or the enlightenment is meant to be something profound, like maybe to those people who want to be liberated, quote unquote, from moral law and whatnot. But it degenerates over time, and people just become really stupid heathens. Whereas Nietzsche, although I do believe he was wrong, of course, once he was into it, there was a lot of gumption and a lot of like actual thought applied to it, even though I ultimately believe he was wrong on a lot of stuff. But America has taken the worst aspects of Nietzsche, misread them, and we're exactly where he says we were going to be, where we're completely motivated by rationality, but we don't have a really driving moral force. So it's always going to be like one revolution happens, then another revolution happens. Then what happens when we actually do reach a perfect economic utopia? We screw it up because we realize that we messed up, I guess, metaphysically speaking, like we have nothing to live for, like, the constant revolutionary. But then there was another aspect that I thought was really awesome that actually made me think about some disagreements you and I have had and how we talk about books. Like Nietzsche talks about the scholar as opposed to the creative, whereas the creative kind of sees something as like a living whole, and then there's like another kind of thought stream that puts things I guess kind of categorizes them, and I'm not going to say make them completely dead, but use them as objects rather than. I'm not saying you say you view everything as an object, but it's like okay. Here's the way to get a little more concise. I will say that I don't like spoilers because the person who's going to read the book needs to read it like as it was meant to be read, like from the first to the last page, and they the spoiler is kind of going to interrupt that life flow, whereas you say that like I guess you're not really saying the opposite of that, but you think that it can, like, once you've read it, like it can be kind of like dissected as if it's dead, where I would say it's still sort of got like a living quantity. That's getting all freaking crazy, and I've been drinking too much scotch. But
I have no idea. Yeah, you lost me. I have no idea what you're saying now.
Needless to say, it's a very, very complicated, thought-provoking book. And I've got a ton of the books that he mentioned with it, and it's made me think, I've come to these conclusions before this, and I've talked about them, about the idea of this hyper-rationality in America perhaps being some sort of like new experiment on like the philosophical road of history, where we take the good things with Christianity specifically, but we apply them to culture. And, that gets into the whole Protestant work ethic. Well, as it degrades over time and things become a little bit more secular, people say that you can replace the Protestant work ethic with a work ethic for this religion, that religion, etc. And, like, we're kind of at that point where we're completely secularized. And even Nietzsche, who wasn't religious, noticed that once that happens and like the last man is completely motivated by rationality and thinks that their morals and like reasons for doing things are backed up by the outside world, I mean, outside physical world, they're both going to be, I guess, violent as well as like really stupid. And I think we have gotten there. And he does a really funny thing towards the end of Closing of the American Mind, where he talks about like at his time when he wrote it in the 80s, he was being exposed to a lot of the postmodernists. And he said it's funny because the uh, the intellectual bad boys and the rock stars at the end of this progression, their whole thing can be boiled down to they think that the work itself is not an objective thing to be looked at, but rather it's a dead thing that they can the beauty lies in their own interpretations of a dead thing. So they're not they don't really have a basis. They're just picking things apart and then consequently applying them and using almost a hermeneutic of their kind of social justicey or completely material based morality. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot to freaking talk about. I can't summarize it in one point, but it's a super, super, super fun book. So it's kind of that thing.
So I was wondering what's because I don't remember this part in it. I'd have to go back. Why is Socrates critiqued as being the hyper-rational? Because the only thing I would say is I would worry that the hyper-rationalism of the West might have been more likely caused by the Enlightenment rather than Socrates. Because Socrates, well, because you could argue if Socrates was pagan and all of that's valid to bring up. But what I wonder is like Socrates himself did think that he was going off of a daemon and definitely not demon, because there is a huge difference. He thought that there was like this spiritual guide, basically. And so it's hard for me to reconcile that view, which actually gets even more abstract and spiritual with someone like Plato, as being like super materialist and rationalist, if that makes sense.
I think we're talking about, maybe I'm talking about the interpretation when I say Socrates, just as it's used in the context of Closing of the American Mind, because I actually have got all of these books and I'm going to read them pretty soon, specifically Plato's Republic.
Okay.
But basically, Socrates, maybe he was talking about.
Nietzsche definitely does criticize Socrates, but I always wondered if it was for a different reason.
Well, basically, here, like he might. I'm not saying he's wrong. It might just be the difference between the real and the interpretation as in Plato's book or whatever. Basically, when he says Socrates, he's meaning the philosopher who believes that a philosopher should be outside of society, play into like pretending that he believes in their gods or whatnot, so that he does, basically saying Socrates is atheist but is pretending, and his mission in life is philosophy and knowing the truth and being outside history. Well, Nietzsche and others would argue that that's wrong, because the very core of what the philosopher does, they learn all the things that they're learning about the world through language, which is meant to communicate. So it's like the thing that we have, our rationality, is a tool as opposed to like an outlook on life. And they believe that it's perhaps immoral for a philosopher to consider himself outside history, because he's not necessarily living like what's true. He's like, he's making himself anti-human by using, falsely a component that's supposed to help humanity. So it's in a way kind of selfish and immoral, like science is. And I've always thought that about hardcore science and math people. I've always thought that they were somewhat immoral and weird anti-humans. Not all of them, but the people who are all in for it. But where was I going? I was going to say something.
The only thing I wonder, I find it interesting that Harold Bloom would utilize Nietzsche to make those arguments, only because I do think that Socrates, because there is the question of like how did Socrates' culture influence his thinking? And so if the critique is against Greek paganism, then that makes sense. But the painful thing about Socrates' life is that he actually went against that grain. And it's just interesting that Bloom would use Nietzsche in a kind of genealogy to describe why Socrates was actually wrong, because it just seems antithetical to at least my interpretation of Socrates and like Plato and even Xenophon, who was another, because it did seem that for Socrates, and maybe it depends on how you analyze intentions as well, but it just seemed like Socrates really cared about the truth. And he wasn't liked exactly for that reason, because it went against the grain and people didn't like that. So I don't necessarily want to read it from my lens, and I'd have to go back to Bloom to like see how he argues this, but it's just interesting because I would have actually given more criticism to Nietzsche. And I think Nietzsche has probably influenced me more than Socrates, but I think there are some interesting problems with Nietzsche, some of which you've brought up. And so it's just interesting that Nietzsche would be more of the model for looking at these things.
Yeah, well, the big point that he makes, and this is really what makes me, tie it back to all the other things that I look through. That like this is like a planned philosophical manipulation that we're living through, and that all of our values are based on this rationality that had to almost artificially be corrupted through the use of philosophy. I don't know how that happens, but it seems to have fully manifested.
Social engineering.
Yeah, social engineering, but like from way, 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 like a continual progress. But anyway, the other thing about, the Socrates thing is that, like, he's talking about the Enlightenment going based off the Socratic model, as in they want to appease the church, at the time, all those scientists and whatnot, but they really like, and it's revealed in their letters and ultimately what has happened, they want science to kind of rule all. So they don't believe, they're basically saying that Socrates, who was killed for not worshiping the gods, was like, it was a tragedy. And so they're wanting to bring about a liberation of scientists and rationality, which they did, but they kind of get it wrong by saying that Socrates himself was against, like if you go back to that whole Plato's cave allegory, it's not that the people in the cave are evil, it's that the people in the cave are fully human, and that the person who goes outside the cave and is staring at the sun and kind of looking down at them, like that interpretation is one who is becoming anti-human and following rationality as opposed to not keeping with the fundamental core of what makes a human. And so you get into all the like annoying ass Gnostic and satanic allegories about the sun, because looking at these guys like all throughout history, that's literally all they do is, and the Masons too, is come up with allegories about the freaking sun. I mean, there's a million of them, and the freaking tarot and everything, and they're just obsessed with it. And I think it honestly all does go back to that dang Plato cave allegory. But the people in the Enlightenment were completely in having rationality be the ruler of the people as opposed to the church. And that gets us where we are now. But I mean, there's all kinds of ways you can go with that, even theologically, about what role the church does, and all that type of stuff. It's just always fun to think about.
I always found the cave allegory to be very heavy-handed and trying too hard. That you have to go to that extreme to make a point, to conjure something that specific to make a point about human behavior. I always just felt it was too heavy-handed.
Yeah, and I really do think it just goes back to the person who's wanting to exist outside of history and humanity by just knowing like the truth that he can see with his own two eyes, or with his five senses, as being somewhat corrupt. And I think again Kant does a very good job of kind of leashing rationality. But that's again way too much to get into, and I'm still.
But I mean, the whole thing about existing outside of history, that reminds me of these documentarians and photographers that stand by and watch, animals kill each other and don't try to interfere. They just let impartial observers. I despise that. How they just let things happen. Because they're making a documentary. There ought to be a point where you will intervene. But whatever.
Yeah. Anyway, it's a super, super fun book.
I think that was an adequate comparison, though, and you kind of just like, yeah, okay, whatever.
Oh no, I thought it was an adequate comparison too.
Okay.
Because those types of people,
because they won't interfere with humans that are hurting each other either, if they're trying to get a good shot,
Yeah, that.
Well,
that would be really
I'm
weird to be
surprised
in
that
position.
I'm surprised that the allegory of the cave. Maybe I read it more neutrally, but I always thought it was just engaging with. I mean, it depends on how you read it, but that it's engaging with this idea that what we perceive is not necessarily what's actually real. So I always saw that as being more of the inspiration for something like The Matrix, where you're showing that you think you know what's actually being perceived. Whether it's true or not is another thing, because it depends on how we look at this. But I just always found that interesting, because I thought it was yeah, I may perceive. So for me, and you can tell based off how I talk about things, I'm always yeah, so I perceive this thing, but is it real? Or is this something that I'm imagining or projecting onto? And I always thought that was an interesting way of looking at what even I directly see, or what I immediately perceive as not being what I think it is. And a lot of that stuff is actually really counterintuitive and kind of unexpected after a while, because then you realize that the way that we cognize things psychologically is often really irrational, and it's surprising.
Yeah,
I wouldn't want to make that as a blanket statement, but that's one of the things that I think about a lot. It's just the things that I think are true. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say the thing about the Matrix comparison is that from everything I've been able to tell, the actual reading of the Matrix isn't. Now, of course, it's portrayed as a good way in the movie, but if you apply it to the whole, I guess, Gnosticism debate, it gets into the satanic thing where this illusion that they're living in, it's not that it's necessarily fake. You have in the movie it is, but if you apply it, take that same formula and put it in terms of religion and what the Gnostics are trying to assert, which of course I don't believe in, they will say that everything is divine and you have to become, basically the whole Crowley thing of do what thou wilt and become your own God. They say that the Matrix is law and morality, and that you have to transcend that to become the true thing. I would argue that that's, that context obviously is the false interpretation, and the sun actually allegory would help my point, is that it's saying you need to be enlightened by the sun when the sun is actually just a physical thing that exists in this universe, but the actual morality exists the same and consistent through all dimensions and whatnot. And so if you think that you can transcend that, you're really just denying the absolute morality that goes beyond, dimension wise, even what the sun would be. It's all interesting to talk about. And the thing is, there's so many freaking different ways to take these allegories that persist through all religions, pagan things. I mean, everything. It gets annoying after a while. I mean, at this point of my studies, I'm really fucking tired of the sun. I'm tired. That's all these people do. It's annoying.
Yeah.
So I don't want to cut anyone off. I should probably get going soon.
Well, now hang on, Phoenix.
Okay.
You got any books that you want to promote or talk about real fast before you go? We're kind of
read Separation Healing. You'll hate it.
Separate Healing, Rogue, Street Kid.
Yeah, but Street Kid, Rogue, Wordless. Yeah. So Rap, even someone that I was able to be on their show for a little bit last week, bought a copy of Rap, which was really cool.
Of what?
Rap, my book. It's poetry, but yeah. So that was pretty cool. So, because he was nice because he was supportive. Like he respected what I was doing or trying to do, and so.
You want to talk about anything from other authors you've been reading before you go?
Well,
or is it just
so I like being on a podcast because it makes me think about a lot of different things, and it's good to process these things in real time. And I guess I would say I'm still a work in progress, but don't hate me too much because I'm paying attention in class. So I'm kidding, but yeah, I'm glad I was able to come on tonight because I really enjoy talking about a variety of things, and I think it's a very well-rounded round table, so to speak, and I think there's a lot of cool things, and I do hope that if people pick up my books that they can try to see it from the spirit in which it was intended, even if they don't always like it. And I am doing my best to have thicker skin. So, but I plan on getting to all of these books. Oh, and I was going to say too, actually, for you, Jeremy, because I'd like to get Sodom and Gomorrah at some point, and I still have Zach's book that I want to read. But I'm surprised that you said that you don't consider yourself a writer, because you were working on the one story, and then that seemed to be going pretty well. You had even asked me for feedback. What happened with that?
I'm working on Esper, still right now. I kind of left the writer tag behind a few years ago when I saw how they were acting in this one community that I used to be a part of. And they kind of sullied the label writer for me. And then I went on Frank's show because he felt I was valid because of my wealth of reading materials, and how many titles I've amassed in my physical and digital libraries. And he asked, if you wouldn't want to be called a writer, what would you call yourself if you get back into writing and publishing? I said, I guess I would be a storyteller. I like that label better,
Yeah. Well, I like your approach because it's very organic, and I think honestly that's something that I find really refreshing. And by organic, I guess not to beat it to death, but I mean it comes out of a general curiosity about things. And I think that's a really rich place to come, or to how do I explain it? I can't even get the right term, but if something is coming out of an interest or curiosity, I feel like that's going to take you to a lot of really good places. And the reason is simply because you have this intention and you're using this intention to, and not that it always has to be moral, but in some ways you make things better, not just for yourself, but through your creative efforts, through, the podcast is a great example with having that. Anyway, I don't know if that makes sense.
But I said that to him before. I said,
you did? Okay, so you know what I mean. No,
I want you to go on, but his creativity seems to be in podcast production, which is good. I'm not saying that it's.
I like the way that you approach books though, because it's about the discussion. It's not always about what you're doing wrong as a writer. You're more just this is what I find interesting, and that's what kind of gets me excited about things. And I try to share the same spirit. I may come from a different place and a different context, but I definitely like that approach. So,
well, thank you.
And I still want to read Anne's book too. I will figure out how to compartmentalize my time better. So, I enjoyed it. So I hope you enjoyed the rest of your evening.
We always appreciate you, Phoenix, and
thank you.
Hope that you'll stop in next weekend.
We want to make a plan to do our little thing on this show. I think it'd be better on here with, of course, everyone, but you, me, and Ben could talk about and discuss House of Leaves at a pretty good length.
Is House of Leaves, are you sure that's the text you want to use? Simply because when you talk about the books you're interested in, it's a much different trajectory.
What do you mean?
So, Bloom is an example. You find his book interesting. House of Leaves might be contrived if, it's not as interesting. I like it, But even
Oh, I
my
love it,
take
too.
on it is that it's also it's good writing, but it reminds me too much of what I don't like about postmodern writing, for lack of a better phrase.
Mhm.
And I'm not saying that's not a reason to talk about it, because I would love to talk about it. I'm just saying if there's something that gets you more excited, then we can do that book instead. If not, House of Leaves is fine.
Yeah, I agree with you that it might actually be kind of hard to talk about it because I hate saying that, like, it's one of those things you just kind of have to experience.
Yeah.
But I think we can somehow pull it off. We might
Okay,
not
no,
do it.
there's
Everybody that comes on here has an opinion on House of Leaves. I think that's amazing. That's wonderful.
yeah. So yeah, maybe House of Leaves then. Just let me know and we'll be in touch.
Hey, we're getting
Okay.
close to our 100th episode. I hope you'll be a part of that too.
Yeah, that'd be fun. I'm excited.
Hey, what if? Hey, would you be interested in maybe reading a little sample from your upcoming Dark Kid book later when you're comfortable with it and it's a little more edited?
Yeah.
Give
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to go over it to get the like bigger thread, but no, there would be tons of things I'd love to share. I can think of so many chapters just right now, and I haven't even really gone over the book yet.
Cool.
So the main reason is, when you write something and you just need a break from it, like that book destroyed me. Like, not even kidding.
What, Dark
it
Kid
was-
or Street Kid? Or
Dark Kid was great writing, but it was so hard to write. Yeah, the Dark Kid. Because with the Street Kid, that was when I was starting to like lay these kind of worlds out, so it was a little bit easier. But then with the Dark Kid, there was just so much I was drawing from, and so it took a little bit more. It took a lot of my energy. But I also think writing books that long also take a lot of energy. So it was a combination of the book itself as well as just how complex it was and how long. So
you said that also characters from Contorted Royal are going to be in Dark Kid. Is this like a shared universe type book? It's going to have a lot of cameos, or
So I described it as, I think it was a couple times ago, I had said that the beautiful thing about this world that I'm building is that through like 13 books or however many it's been, is that it's always from a different point of view, and it's always a different, even a different timeline, unless I'm wrapping into other things that have happened before. But one of the things I try to emphasize is the perspective. So the Street Kid is from Phoenix's perspective. The Dark Kid is definitely from the Dark Kid's perspective, though. So what I like about that is the contrast, specifically with the Street Kid and the Dark Kid, because one of the most obvious examples and metaphors that we've talked about and that I use in the book is the notion of the Dark Kid as a book, but also the Street Kid as a book, and how the Dark Kid as a book influences the Street Kid, and then the Street Kid as a book influences the Dark Kid.
That's perfect. Yeah. That's what I was hoping for. I love it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
I love crossovers.
Yeah. So
The weirder the better.
and another way to describe it as well, because I realized this as I was writing it, was the Dark Kid is happening in parallel to the Street Kid.
That much is clear, I remember, when he talks about Dark Kid in some passages. Yeah, that much is clear.
Yeah. So yeah, I'd love to read something from that. I think that'd be cool.
Anne's in her riot cop gear.
My
All right,
outer
take it
space
easy.
helmet.
Hey, thank you, Phoenix.
Yeah.
Hope you drop by
See you, Anne. See you,
soon.
Ben.
Lovely
talk to you later.
All right, so what were you saying, Anne?
Oh, I just said lovely to talk to you to him, but I just before I fade out at some point, I gotta if I don't say goodbye to everyone, it's because it's still 109. Well, it's because I'm running the one errand I have to get done before my other thing starts. And so I had to go outside, which, I thought I could show our viewers all the beautiful shit there is to see in the paradise that is Palm Springs. But mostly I've succeeded in finding out that it's still 109 degrees out, so my phone keeps overheating.
Have you read anything useful lately, Anne?
You know what? I hadn't read him. It's shameful. He died right before I started reading him, just like Kingsley Amis. But I was tipped off to the satirical wonderland that is Tom Wolfe. And oh my God, I'm laughing my face off.
Electrical acid test?
I started with the one about New York, cops in New York. God damn it. Bonfire of the Vanities, named after that bonfire in, what was it, Venice? Or was it? No, it was Firenze, I think. Anyway, it's like I said, it's like you take a little bit of the best of Updike and you take a little bit of the best of Roth, and you find, genuinely likable, hateable characters, and just the best fucking. I mean, the depth of the texture in this satire, it's like you're watching a punk rock drummer play, but he's got just not enough jazz background to be a douchebag, but just enough of a jazz feel to throw in like incessant amounts of unexpected but perfectly fitting stuff.
Now, what is the main thread in Bonfire of the Vanities? I'm not familiar with it. Haven't even seen the movie. What's? Okay, I think she froze. Went overheated again. So Zach, did you have anything else you wanted to talk about reading wise?
Yeah, let me go back. Talked about Dodgeball High. I talked about Closing of the American Mind and Deep Blue Goodbye. Leonard and Hungry Paul. I'm about done with one book. I guess I'll just save it for the next time when I am done with it. I am also reading another book that I cannot wait to I just started it, so I'm not that far into it. But I can't wait to really dig into it because it's actually the first adult novel that I ever attempted reading when I think maybe I was in 6th grade. I can't remember exactly. It was a Predator tie-in novel called Predator Turnabout by Steve Perry. And I freaking loved it while I was reading it as a kid. And then I lost it before I finished it. So now I get to see what actually freaking happens at the end of it.
See, Steve Perry wrote a lot of Conan novels too. So he's good at that. I don't know, not fanfic, but novel adaptations of popular franchises.
Yeah, he did Alien ones. I think he wrote for one of the Batman cartoons. He did a lot of stuff, but I've got a feeling his original stuff is probably horrible, though. I don't know why. I get that impression.
Too derivative, maybe. What else?
I'm also reading a book that you sent me a long time ago, and I'm just now getting to read it. Or getting around to it. Is Marx and Satanism.
Oh yeah.
Have you read or finished that one?
Long time ago. I don't know that I remember much about it now. I do remember that I thought he made a compelling case, but I don't remember the substance of it. It's been so long ago.
Yeah, so. I think right now because I'm about done with it. I guess I can just talk about it. I think his main problem is that he's not describing exactly what Marx is, how he's like a quote, like an actual Satanist, as opposed to just kind of evil. He does have a lot of early poems praising Satan, as well as he went through a whole religious crisis to where he became completely anti-religious. The question is was he a full-on atheist, or was he really motivated by harming humanity? That's the main crux of everything.
I don't get humanist vibes from Marx.
No, I don't either.
I mean, he was a humanist for a while. He got that from I think his name is Feuerbach, and he was basically kind of the father of humanism with his book The Essence of Christianity. But he took a turn from humanist to a more a scientific materialist viewpoint when Stirner published The Ego on Its Own.
The weird thing, though, is that there's two things that make me think that maybe something was going on behind the scenes with his thinking. Because first off, his teenage poems, which you could scrap and throw away and say that was just him being an edgelord, but they are explicitly praising Satanism in kind of a horror movie way. He's not getting into the Gnosticism, which is what Satanists typically hide behind, because they kind of turn the narrative upside down and point out that, like, say the evil demonic aspects in something like The Exorcist falls in line with the worldview of traditional Christianity, where good is good and evil is evil, whereas Gnostics kind of turn that all, upside down and whatnot. But anyway, Marx was influenced by a very weird philosophical / religious / all over the place figure named what was his name? Something Moses. Like Moses was his last name or something. What was his name?
This is why I call Marxism Teutonic voodoo.
Yeah, it's really weird. I'm forgetting this dude's name. He was I guess you could almost, the way he's presented in this book is almost like a Jewish anti-Jew. Like, he's anti-Christian as well, but he's this really weird, destructive dude. It's like
Self-hating.
literally more than that. It's like he's both a supremacist, both self-hating.
Moses Hess.
Yeah, Moses Hess. That dude's weird. Some of the shit he came up with, it's like you can't put it into any paradigm other than he was just wanting to, like, muddy the waters and
labor Zionism.
Yeah, but then he contradicted himself so much with that.
Which sounds almost like a Jewish version of Nazism.
Yeah, it's a lot of he's a really weird manipulative figure that reminds me of Mr. Henry from the Picture of Dorian Gray and his, as it's presented in this book, his influence on Marx. It's like he took him under his wing and turned him into like an evil bastard or something. Anyway, that dude was like flat out evil. But there's another thing that points to maybe Marx actually wasn't an atheist, because there's an account of one of his maids or something catching him in some kind of like religious ceremony, and they've not been able to figure out exactly what it was. So a lot of stuff's up in the air, but I never knew that there was this much, I'm not going to say depth, but questioning as to the true motives of Marx, because I always just took him at his word and thought that he was wrong, but just his motivations were some kind of like it was just like another form of economic. I mean, that sounds stupid to say, but I mean, I didn't think there's anything else going on other than him thinking that this economic system would solve the world's problems. But maybe there was a little something going on behind the scenes. Whether it was a legit Satanism, I mean, who knows? It's not. Nobody knew.
I mean, the thing is, Marx could be like weird about criticism because, like I mentioned before, Max Stirner was more likely than not a very heavy influence on him, even though Marx would deny that. He actually wrote a critique of Stirner, which was longer than all of what Stirner had written in his lifetime, and it was basically just like it just spent the whole time mocking him. It barely made any points at all.
Yeah,
which kind of makes me think he just didn't have a response to Stirner or didn't understand it.
Wait, who? This dude or
Max Stirner?
Oh, Max Stirner. Yeah, I need to actually read him because I've read a ton of people that cite him like crazy.
Yeah, the Ego on its Own is one of my favorite philosophical books.
That sounds gross.
Anything
I'm going to
else?
read it though, but it sounds gross.
But I mean, the more literal interpretation of the title is the unique in its property.
Anything else, Zach?
No, that's the majority of what I've been reading.
Okay, so Ann, you were talking about Tom Wolfe a minute ago. Bonfire of the Vanities. What is the whole story behind Bonfire? What is it that grabs you? She's muted. I didn't mute her.
There we go. Okay, I gave this whole heartfelt paean to Tom Wolfe, and then I looked down and realized that my phone had overheated again.
Try it again.
But the plot of the book is largely about a snobby, very alcoholic English tabloid writer in New York City who suddenly decides that since he's probably about to get fired, he needs to do his job. So he sticks his nose into a story that he doesn't research particularly well, that's way more complicated and in-depth than one would expect. And since it's not expected, he doesn't bother to research it. And I mean, it's a great satire of the way British people and some Europeans are just horribly snobby to Americans while being at least as crass as we are. But you know, it also satirizes Americans. It's just so sharp. I guess where Philip Roth errs on the side of being all satire with just a token bit of likability, and Rabbit and Updike err on the side of being totally likable, but once in a while you realize you're a jerk, so you throw in a token bit of satire. Wolfe somehow makes his characters sympathetic through pure satire. And it's and his language, it's not just like fancy choice of words or a large vocabulary or anything. His language directly serves the layers and layers and layers of irony and, you know, just different forms of humor that he's throwing in. The metaphor that I made while my phone was overheating was, it's kind of like watching a punk rock drummer who's not had enough, you know, jazz education to make him a douchebag, but just enough to allow him to just throw neat little shit in here and there. So you're reading this really sharp, driving, powerful satire, but there are all these like unexpected Baroque frills that just, you know, you could, this is one of those books where you could give me a spoiler and I would keep reading avidly, because the way the jokes unfurl and the way the situations unfurl are totally satisfying in and of themselves.
Okay. What about the other, the Tales from the City or by Armistead Maupin that you were reading? Did you ever finish that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, actually, I already covered this talking completely to myself, but I felt I felt bad after reading Wolfe because I'd gone on a couple of rants on Twitter the previous week about how, you know, if you look at Wolfe, if you look at Updike and Kerouac and all those guys, I start to suspect that all you had to do to have a writing career in the 60s and 70s was to move to California and throw up on a typewriter. And then somebody recommends Tom Wolfe to me, and it's just, wow, okay, I take it back. Like this guy is everything people like John Updike and I don't mean to keep twisting the knife of the fact that I don't like these books that you love. I mean, everybody loves what they love. It's just I'm the kind of person who decided my college major based on the fact that I liked Juvenal's satire so much that I wanted to be able to read it in Latin. So I'm a little bit heavily slanted toward enjoying satire, and Wolfe does. I would say it's the best I've read by an American ever, as far as satire goes.
Tom Wolfe is.
Yeah.
Would you give up on the Armistead Maupin, whatever?
I got through it, but I just felt empty. You know, it's not like it's hard to read. It's not like hyper pretentious. It's very clear and fairly simple. It's just, it feels like a flatly written sitcom.
I mean, that's what I get just from the title. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely not one for the ages. He seemed to think that just putting a few gay characters in there makes it so edgy that that's all I have to do. And
yeah,
you know, Now that it's 2020, you look at it and you're like, so you got this gay guy standing here. Are you going to have him do anything interesting? No. No, he's just standing there. Okay, cool, whatever. Next. Yeah, so Maupin sort of inspired me to say that, to get a career during that time period, you just had to move to California and throw up on a typewriter. But Tom Wolfe kind of made me eat my words.
Cool. So, anything else?
I've been completely immersed in that book, and also I'm busy. I've been swimming about 2 hours a day because this is the first time. This is a historical moment for me. You know how jackasses like Gordon Ramsay will talk about their shows as if they have a history. This is the first time in crazy chef history that we've had someone just make fried eggs. So if you're going to do that to this show, this is the first time in this show's history that Anne has not been homeless. So
wait. But you were living in the hotel room, right?
Yeah. Well, that's not really a home. You know what I mean? Like I actually have an apartment where I'm going to be staying for at least 3 months.
Good. Okay.
Which it's, I don't have drunk people banging on my door trying to get in like I did at the hotel, which was full of homeless people. I mean, since I was technically homeless, I probably could have stayed there for free if I'd known and mentioned it. Oh, I'm homeless. Can I stay here for free?
And you still have the cats.
Yeah.
Here, right?
Yeah, they follow me everywhere. I've started calling them the albatrosses because every time I look at my housing options, you check the cat-friendly box and like 95% of the places you could rent disappear. But, I made a commitment. I can't let those little furry fuckers down.
Especially Stumpler. He's been through a lot. He's been through some trauma.
Yeah, he's lost his poor little tail.
Oh. So, Ben, you've probably been wanting to talk for a while. What have you been reading lately?
The first thing I've been reading is James Ellroy's Blood on the Moon. It's one of his earlier works, so it's before he developed that telegrammatic sentence that he's famous for. So it's more accessible, I guess, to most people. It's also a lot more straightforward. It has a simpler plot than a lot of his later books do, and the cop in it could actually be considered a good guy, whereas like his later books, there are just literally no good guys. Everyone's an asshole. It's pretty good so far, pretty engaging mystery, but it definitely has his signature gruesomeness with a serial killer who kills women in really really graphic ways. Also read Audrey Zaz's Invisibility, a Manifesto. It's really hard to describe that book. It's an amphetamine sulfate book, and it's kind of a novelette, but it's got these two storylines going on. One is like this girl named Tina who's being trafficked by her mother, and the other is a character named Audrey Zaz who claims that she's like a girl detective, and it like goes through with talking about Tina being trafficked and Audrey getting involved in a serial killer. It's really hard to describe, but I really enjoyed it. I found it really engaging. It was a really great surrealist work with a lot of funny moments. Like there's a moment where the Audrey Zaz character in the book is sleeping with one of her friend's dads, and like he's in the car, and like this dad rock song comes on. I can't remember which one, but she talks about being like embarrassed while he does like air guitar to it. So there's like a lot of like really funny dark humor in it. And I just think it's a really great novelette. After I read it, I like immediately ordered her other books because I liked it so much.
Only 54 pages, huh?
Yeah, it's like a novelette. It's a chapbook like Amphetamine Sulfate puts out, but it's really good. I highly recommend it. I also read, I'm going to mispronounce his name, but John Baltusberger's Shards of Shattered Sentiments, which is a chapbook of horror-based poetry. Like all of the poems are like about cosmic horror. It's a I thought it was a pretty solid collection. Don't have too much to say about it, but I did enjoy it.
I've never heard of this guy, yeah, but
he runs the press, Madness Heart Press, and he's also he also ran the Killer Con online this year.
oh, the one that you participated in the gross out portion.
Yeah.
Oh, this other book, the Trafe Magic, that it actually sounds pretty interesting. Ze'ev leads a strange double life as an exorcist and monster hunter for the Jewish community of Texas. What starts as a simple exorcism reveals him to the schemes of a sordid necromancer who will stop at nothing to kill anyone who stands in his way. The madman sends an assassin after Ze'ev, setting off a chain of events that has him dodging cultists, ghouls, the cops, and an overweight bulldog at every turn. And that sounds interesting. That's 1,194 pages. That may be an error.
I think that's an error, yeah. It's not that long.
Oh, it's not even out yet. It comes out August 31st. Okay.
Yeah. That book actually came to me as a bonus for another book I ordered, which was, I haven't read it yet, but it's called Corners of the World of the Book, which is like a collection of Jewish mythology-based poetry and stories.
So what'd you think?
I haven't read it yet.
Oh, okay.
I just read of Shards of Shattered Sentiment because it was short.
John Baltusberger. Are we gonna hear? Are we gonna be hearing more from this guy like quite often? Is he good?
It seems like a cool guy to me. Like I said, I've only read his poetry and I really enjoy it. I haven't read any of his prose yet. I know that Lucas Magnum has a book published under Madness Heart Press, which Baltusberger runs.
Okay. Yeah, this guy seems to have a nice aesthetic as far as covers and all that. And he's got sharp synopses, which, it's usually what sells me on a book or not. So, oh, there's a book called Vampire Christ. What? I think I'm dreaming this right now. Yeah. Have I reached a portion where I'm dreaming?
Where did you see that?
I don't know. It just vanished.
You were hovering over one of the books.
Yes.
The synopsis. Yes. I think it was the other one on the end.
Where'd it go?
It's the other one on the end. That one.
Yeah. Okay, there. I did not imagine it. Jay Wilburn. Oh, that's the guy who won. That's the guy who won the gross out contest.
Yeah.
Correct.
Maybe it's not on Goodreads. Maybe you'd have to Google it.
That guy's got a book called Time Eaters. That sounds interesting too. Yeah, I'm definitely dropping out. I'm definitely fading. But no, I must endure for a little bit longer. Okay. Because I still got to talk about the stuff that I read, and it's quite a lot. But I'll try to make it not too long. If I can get myself together here, because I'm about to drop. Oh my God, the loading time is so slow. All right, I talked about Leonard Hungry Paul and what a disappointment it was, a major disappointment. Oh my God. Where he didn't solve any problem. There was no tension in the plot whatsoever. No conflict. Leonard and Hungry Paul was a total dud. For some reason, I continue to read Terry Goodkind novels. I think just because I grew up in high school reading them, and so I feel an attachment in that way. It's not that Goodkind is losing his ability to tell a story. It's that he goes like he makes strange choices, in terms of what his characters choose to do and what they think is moral and right and everything. Um, and what do they call an overpowered male character? A Gary Stew, not a Mary Sue, but a Gary Stew, right? Hello.
I've actually never heard that. I've actually never heard that, but I'll take your word for
Yeah,
it. So
Gary
that's
Stew or Marty Stew, either of those.
Well, anyway, so yeah, I read Siege of Stone, and I'm almost through with Heart of Black Ice by Terry Goodkind. And keep in mind, I reviewed another one of his books a while back called Into Darkness, where the Lord Rawl actually goes to what is all intents and purposes the planet Mars, and we're in the medieval times, and he saves their civilization while he's at it. It's getting really out of control with the whole Lord Rawl, and how he's always right, can do no wrong. It's insane. I mean, it was a somewhat grounded fantasy series, The Sword of Truth, until he took the Lord Rawl, Richard Rawl, in through a machine into a red planet, a red dimension that's like Mars. Terry Goodkind is like the Ed Wood of sword and sorcery now. I just he does weird. He makes weird choices, man, and it's like he plays it all as if it's deathly serious, and you have to laugh at him. He takes himself so seriously, and he's so clearly a joker. That's my frustration with Goodkind as it stands. But he could still tell a good fantasy story, and I'll stand by that. But he's nowhere near as good as the fresh Matthew Knight, who wrote Karnov, phantom-clad rider of the cosmic ice. That's a mouthful. Along with two other guys who are actually in a black metal band called Bal Sagoth. Anybody heard of Bal Sagoth?
No, but I like the name.
Well, they do these like heavy metal concept albums with the Boris Vallejo type art, scantily clad, riding like Arabian horses with sword, drawn, ready to attack. Those types of, that type of imagery. Well, anyways, Karnov is gifted with the cosmic ice, which is this energy that surrounds him, his weapons, and whoever he's protecting. And he goes around slaying sorcerers and particularly vampires until he is befriended by a vampire whose power was stolen by the more corruptible younger vampires. And it's pretty cool how the vampire transforms this moose. I think he bites this moose's neck, drains it of its blood, and then turns it into his flying steed. Basically, he turns a moose into an undead flying vampire moose. And he becomes like Karnov's like traveling, not sidekick, but partner, in fighting or whatever. This is really fascinating. It would be a great Iron Maiden album, but it's also a great book. I gave it 5 stars, and I hope there's more to it. There's a lot of people writing like sword and sorcery nowadays and giving really fresh takes, like him and like the guy who wrote Gunthar here. Where'd it go? Gunthar, Warrior of the Lost World. But unlike Karnov, Gunthar is a lot more true to the Conan formula, where Karnov is going off and the authors of Karnov are going off and doing their own thing. It's almost totally new, when he befriends a vampire and his undead moose. I read The Girls Like Vodka by Chris Lesko, who's another Joker, man. I mean, he really is good at painting these slice of life, scenarios from the purely mundane happenings of a Saturday afternoon in a trailer park, where it's just dirty and there's vodka bottles laying all around, and his idea of entertainment is watching them dance on these girls dance on his bed in the reflection of a turned off TV. Lesko, I love how Lesko like embraces, like, I don't know, trailer trash and turns it into something profound on the other side. He's really good at that. I know I may be rambling a little bit, but this is all I have left to give. So, also, for some reason, I think this book was free a long time ago, like a few years ago when I picked it up, called #1 in the Southern Watch series. And this demon hunter shows up in Tennessee with a sword and cloak, and he saves this police officer named Archer from a demon attack. And slowly, over the course of the novel, Arch and the demon hunter become close friends, and he kind of initiates Arch into the school of demon hunting. I was impressed enough to pick up the second volume, which I'll probably be reading soon. It's not amazing by any means, but it's just passable enough that if it were a video on the shelves of Blockbuster and I was like 12 years old, it would have been a kick-ass movie for that time, History. Boy, that's loud. Dude needs a muffler. Then in the History of the Marvel Universe, which actually has a wraparound story of Franklin Richards. First off, does anyone here proficient enough in their comic book reading that they know who Franklin Richards is?
No.
Ben, I think you'd be the only one possibly that would get that reference.
I don't know.
Okay. So Franklin Richards is like this all-powerful son of Reed Richards and Sue Storm of the Fantastic Four. And it shows him and Galactus, the Eater of Worlds, at the end of time. They're the last two left. There's nothing but blackness. And they're about to transition into the new universe that is, sprung in the next Big Bang. And Galactus is basically telling Franklin an adult cosmic version of a bedtime story where he recounts the main thrusts of the entire history of the Marvel Universe. I mean, it covers everything from the primordial, like caveman times of Marvel, when the first Ghost Rider rode a woolly mammoth, all the way up to like 2099 when there's like a futuristic Spider-Man, and everything in between. Really great. No social justice bullshit. No fat acceptance superhero like Trailblazer in this. So I appreciated that. Mint Condition is about the baseball card habit. I've never collected baseball cards in my life, but I read this more as a curiosity than anything, and just to see, how it could possibly warrant someone writing an entire book about it. It's actually pretty interesting. I think the most interesting thing I took away from it is that Topps used the court system to prevent other people from selling cards with bubble gum for like 25 years until a judge rendered that it was that baseball cards and bubble gum were an American institution, and therefore they could not have the sole ownership of that practice. It basically became what's called the bubblegum wars. That happened. That happened in the Supreme Court of America, if you can believe it. So it was interesting as a curiosity, nothing more. The Last Word, I really dislike this book about a girl who inherits her father's company, but gets shafted out of it through legal maneuvers and whatnot. And I think there were about 6 or 7 chapters around the middle of this book where people were waking up in shackles and gags, and being tortured with loud noises, aka as like MK Ultra, it got really old, and and I'm well schooled on my women in shackles scenes, and so if I think that the guy overdid it with the scenes in this book, then they probably overdid it. Really annoying book. It was annoying by the end. How many people just had hypodermic syringes on standby, 5 and 6, for anybody who tried to cross them. Really obnoxious book. But I've heard the guy has written some other good stuff that's actually good. Leonard and Hungry Paul, I covered that. Sex and the Serial Killer, My Bizarre Times with Robert Durst. Who knows who Robert Durst is? No one?
No.
Okay, well, he's this magnate, Magnate, in New York, who basically grew up in Manhattan, getting away with whatever he wanted to, due to who his family was, who his parents were, and everything. And there was a documentary with him a few years ago called The Jinx, where he didn't take his microphone off when he went to the bathroom, and he basically admitted on the hot mic in the bathroom that he killed all these people, that during the interview, he was actually had defenses for, being, having alibis and being innocent. Okay. But no, this guy straight up iced his wife in the 80s. And this guy sort of fell into a forced friendship with Robert Durst, according to his account, in the 80s and 90s, where Durst would come over and bring women, and he would, take pictures of them pretending to be dead, and all sorts of weird shit. All these women that Durst was caught up with would end up going to this author for help, and and they would end up in more trouble. It's this guy had to wait until after all this shit with HBO and that documentary happened for him to come forward with all this bullshit that he put up with. That he knew that the guy had killed his wife. If this account is true, he knew all the time that Durst had killed his wife, and only spoke up after he had been caught red-handed on an HBO documentary. So that puts his credibility, in question for me. But it was still a very entertaining, dirty laundry type book. Another Marvel Comics offering. I thought this was awesome. Hit Monkey. It's a hitman who's basically a baboon or a snow macaque or whatever in like the Himalayas, and he learns how to shoot a gun and looks pretty spiffy in a tuxedo, a suit and tie. Hit Monkey is awesome. Definitely needs to be Deadpool's sidekick for a while. But and moments before I started this show, I read Kowloon Walled City 1984, which is about this guy who gets into these underground fighting matches, tournaments and whatnot. Think like Bloodsport and Kickboxer, like the Van Damme movies, that kind of thing. Only some people take his girlfriend and kind of hold her as collateral, so he will throw a fight in the upcoming tournament. And they've got ties to law enforcement there in the walled city. And so it's 5-star because it captures that feeling of old Van Damme and Seagal movies so well to me. And I've always thought that the walled city Kowloon was fascinating anyway, just because of the way it's laid out. I mean, you guys have all seen those pictures, right? We've all seen pictures of Kowloon walled city, right?
Yeah, I have. That's pretty awesome.
And 1984 happens to be the year that the city stopped operation because China reclaimed that land, right?
I can't remember if that's what happened. I think that part of the reason is it was in a sort of like the land it was built on was sort of a legal limbo. But at one point, like the authorities, I can't remember if it was China or Hong Kong, just like sent in like police to just clear out the city and then dismantle it.
Yeah, and they might have been better off keeping Kowloon open, because you've seen what those people in Hong Kong sleep in now, right? They're like basically metal cages. It can't be good on the back, And people live in like they basically live out of and sleep in these little metal cages that you're crammed into. And I mean, from wall to wall, and even extending all the way up to rooftops, these people are living in these little, metal cages. Because the housing crisis is so bad over there in Hong Kong. But yeah, this was a nice like kung fu kickboxer type homage. So, okay, I hope I didn't ramble too much. Basically, the best thing I read out of all those was Karnov, Phantom Clad Rider of the Cosmic Ice. So there's some 5-star stuff and some 1-star stuff in there. That's what I've been doing the last 2 weeks, though. So. I 20 books ahead of my Goodreads goal too, so that's nice. Anyway, I don't know. Do we have anything else to talk about? I lost Dan. We lost Dan for good, I think.
Yeah, I think we're done for tonight.
Yeah.
I bet it was my comment about women in shackles that scared her off.
Of course.
Okay. Well, she did say if I don't say goodbye, my phone overheated. That's what she said. So, is there anything else that any other messages any of us want to impart before we close this baby down for the week?
I would say go check out that Indie Rock Dinosaur episode. That was super fun.
And so Ken Amy is your